Nuevo Laredo. Kathryn Flachsbart is a career member of the Foreign Service and a 2018 graduate of the National Defense University's Eisenhower School for National Security and Research Strategy. From 2014 to 2017, she served as the director of the Consular Training Division at the Foreign Service Institute. Her prior domestic assignments were in the Bureau of Consular Affairs, in both the Office of Public Affairs and Policy Coordination, and in the Office of Children's Issues, and in the Bureau of European Affairs at the Switzerland and Liechtenstein. There you go. Desk officer. Overseas, she has served at Poland, Botswana, Germany, Bolivia, where she was the chief of the consular section. Ms. Flachsbart's work has been recognized with Superior Honor Award, 2 Meritorious Honor Awards, and 1 Group Superior Honor Award. Ms. Flachsbart holds a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and master's degree from the National Defense University. So ladies, this is the brain you want to pick. And she's very busy, so make sure you have your questions ready, okay? All right, listas? See? Okay. All right, Ms. Flachsbart, you take it away.
All right, I'm going to stand up. I like to walk and talk. My bio is really long and very dry.
Very impressive.
Thanks. It's dry. Anyway, when Cesar asked if I would come talk to the Women Entrepreneurs Rock group, which I think you should call We Rock, my first response was, but I'm not an entrepreneur. So I can't talk about business strategy. I could, but it wouldn't be particularly credible and it might be kind of bogus. I can't really talk about how to grow your plan or any of those issues, but then they suggested that I could talk about leadership, and I said, okay, well, that's something I can certainly get behind because it's something that I love to talk about. And then they told me I got to do it in English, and I was like, all right, I'm sold. But I don't want to start with me talking. I want to start with all of you talking. So when I say leadership, what does that actually mean to you? What is leadership? Anyone?
Clearing the path, setting the standard for moving forward and bringing people with you.
Yep, I like that. Setting the standard, clearing the path, and bringing people with you. I love that idea of bringing them along. What else? Responsibility. Yep, absolutely. Anything else? Right. So it implies that a leader has to have what? Power. Maybe. We'll talk about that. Motivation, definitely. Followers. Leaders have to have followers. What else? Pardon? Courage. You have to have guts. That's right. So I sort of went back to the basics and said, let's see if we can find a good definition of leadership. Because let's face it, there's a million books out there. And everybody has their own definition. And you can Google quotes until, the end of next week, and you'll still not find necessarily the perfect definition of leadership. So I found one that I liked. And that is a guy named Kevin Cruz, who was writing in Forbes. And he said that leadership is a process of social influence which maximizes the efforts of others towards the achievement of a goal. It's really simple, right? And I like it because it's in its simplicity, it captures a really, really complicated thing. It incorporates that fact that you can't be a leader in a vacuum, that you have to have followers, and that you have to get those followers to go along with you. It also captures the fact that you have to have a goal. There needs to be an end objective of leadership. Leadership just for the sake of leadership isn't leadership, it's something else. And it also, I love this idea of social influence. Now, setting aside sort of the concept of social media and influencers and all of that, because I think there's a really interesting leadership conversation there that's completely separate. The idea that you have to be able to shape and motivate as a leader is also really interesting. So Cruz breaks it down. He says, social influence specifically is not authority or power. The ability to go to someone and say, you have to do this, you must do this, you are directed to do this is not leadership, okay? It's management. It is direction, it is a part of it, but that's not a component for me of my definition of leadership. Leadership is not authority, leadership is ability. Leadership, according to Cruz, also requires others. But he goes on to point out that it's not a defined relationship, and I love that because leadership is not necessarily about a manager and a subordinate. Again, that's management. Leadership is about the people that surround you. It's about bringing people forward together who have distinct interests, who have distinct objectives, who have distinct goals, and who aren't necessarily in your chain of command. In fact, in most of my career, my leadership opportunities have not been with direct subordinates. I didn't get where I got because of my ability to make other people that reported to me whose evaluations I wrote had do their jobs, although that was certainly a component of it, but it's because I was able to influence the people around me who I didn't have authority over. One of my favorite jobs in the Foreign Service was actually a job that I described as being frustrating and incredibly rewarding because it was a coordination position. And when you say coordination in government, what that basically means is you have coordination responsibility but zero authority, which means you have no mandate with which to actually direct people and a responsibility to make them all move in the same direction. Cruz also says that there are many styles, many paths to effective leadership, and I think that's a really important thing too. And if you have one big takeaway from this conversation, I think that's it. Everybody has to find their own way. Not every leadership model fits for every person. If it did, we wouldn't have 7,000 different books on leadership out there that you could read that all propose different models. You have to find your own leadership truth, your own path. So, and it includes a goal. Now, I'm not necessarily wedded to this idea that there has to be a finite goal. And maybe that shows my background in diplomacy where, you know, the end goal is not tomorrow, and it's not the number of widgets that you produce, and it's not a bottom line or a profit margin. The goal for us is usually much, much more amorphous and much more unclearly defined. But the power in that idea of a goal is that really good leaders, for me, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, are ones who can create a vision. And then more importantly, can articulate that vision, can put a goal in front of people that they can strive for, even when a goal may not be easy to define. So I was thinking that since I'm talking about leadership, I should probably put my own personal definition of leadership together. Now, when I was in grad school at the National Defense University, nobody does leadership better than the Department of Defense, right? And they made us all write these papers that were like 8 pages long on what our leadership vision is. Don't worry, I'm not going to spend 8 pages on that. But for me, leadership is the ability to define and articulate a vision, to get people to coalesce around that vision, and then to motivate action forward. And it's also about sustaining that motivation. So leadership isn't a one-time thing. It's a constant process of getting people to stay unified around an objective. So that being said, what makes a good leader? What are the traits of good leaders? Think about the leaders that you have worked with or for or been around or heard speak or read books by. What traits do they have in common? Emotional intelligence. One of my favorites. Yeah. What else? Transparency. Yeah, that's a big one. It's a big one. Accountability. My team will tell you that that's a big word for me. I talk about that one a lot. Anything else? Empathy. Yeah. It goes together with the emotional intelligence piece, but it's not necessarily the same thing. For me, emotional intelligence is the ability to tell how people are feeling, and empathy is the ability to respond appropriately. And they're not necessarily the same thing. And in fact, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but for me, I inherited from my mother the extraordinary gift of emotional intelligence. She was perhaps the most emotionally intelligent person that I've ever encountered. And what I as a leader had to learn was when to actually take that information, but turn it off sometimes. And to realize that I could be aware of everything that was going on for the people that I was working with and for, and what their worries and their concerns and their objectives were, but I also needed to help them overcome those. And by sitting in the moment with them, I wasn't necessarily helping them move forward. And that was a hard lesson for me to learn, because that's not something, you know, when they sit down and try to teach leaders about emotional intelligence, it's coming from a place of people don't understand emotional intelligence. It's a skill they need to develop. It never occurred to me until not too very long ago that it was also a skill that you sometimes needed to balance with other skills, with the ability to direct as well as to motivate. All right, so again in Forbes, a guy named Louis Fron laid out a couple of key traits for leaders, and I really like how he frames this. He says that leaders are responsible for establishing trust, demonstrating care, and practicing servant leadership. He comes at it from an angle that I respond to, because his is all about the people that you work with and for. And I think that's a really important thing for people who want to be successful leaders to remember, is that you are working for other people. You may be the boss, you may be the person out front, but if you don't bring the people along with you, if you are not cognizant of their needs, of their motivations, and of their challenges, then they're not going to follow, and then you're not a leader anymore. A guy named Peter Economy in Inc. magazine lays it out differently. He talks about clarity, decisiveness, courage, passion, and humility. And I think that that is all also really, really relevant. Perhaps the greatest leader that I have ever had the privilege of working for from a very, very, very far distance, and also hearing speak, was Colin Powell. And the thing that really stands out about him is his humility. He sits in it very comfortably. He walks into a room and you know that's the guy in charge. You know that is the person that people are willing to follow. He owns it, but he doesn't advertise it. It's simply who he is. And I think that is the humility that leaders need to strive for. We've all worked for people with false humility, right? It doesn't work, because it's false and everyone knows it. You have to have true humility that allows you room to own who you are and to own your capabilities, and still be humble. At the Department of State, we actually have leadership and management principles that are articulated. It's the Department of State where we live by our words, so we can't keep it short. But in a nutshell, our leadership and management principles are the following. We model integrity. We learn and innovate constantly. We communicate. We value and develop people. We are self-aware. We plan strategically, which is really a core management principle. It's a component of leadership, but it's more management. We'll talk about that in a second. We are decisive and we take responsibility. We manage conflict, we collaborate, and we foster resilience. These are the governing principles for everyone who works in the Department of State. This is not something that they hand you when you become a Consul General for the first time. This is not something that they give you when you lead your first team. This is something that we give you on day one. when you join the Department of State. It took us a long time to get there. The Department of State needed to have a conversation within itself about what leadership is and how we define it before we got to the point of articulating leadership and management principles. I've been in the department for over 20 years now. This has been a 20-year process of figuring out what we wanted to articulate about ourselves. But it's also really important that everyone in our organization understand that this is a living document. And that how we define who we are and what we achieve as leaders is something that can be guided by principles, but they're principles, they're not rules, they're not a checklist. They are something that guides, but then has room for people to find their own way. I have personal criteria for leadership as well. Now, my personal criteria for leadership are very strongly shaped by the department's leadership principles and by the Bureau of Consular Affairs' leadership tenets, which came before. But they also have become my own. One is that leaders must articulate a vision. They have to have purpose, they have to have passion, and they have to have clarity. If they do not have those things, no one else is going to be able to bring the same things to the table. So it's our responsibility as leaders to not just have that vision, but to communicate that vision. And we have to believe in it. You can't be effective as a leader if you don't believe in the vision that you're trying to communicate to everybody else. If you don't believe in it, nobody's going to believe in it. So purpose and passion are essential. You have to understand your team. And the most important piece of this is listening. There's a Colin Powell quote, and I didn't pull it out, but it's something along the lines of people need to feel like they can bring you their problems, and if they're not bringing your problems, then you're not leading them. And I think that's really relevant. You have to have an open door. It may be past 2 locked doors with a special code that you have to get into, and you have to call in advance, otherwise you can't come down the hall and all of that, but it has to be open. And people have to believe that if they come to you, if they take the courage to come to the boss, or in the case of some of my staff, the boss's boss, or the boss's 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 boss, that you're gonna be heard. That person is gonna take the time to sit down with you, to come out from behind the desk, to look at you in the eyes and to hear what you have to say before they start problem solving. You also have to understand what motivates people. And you have to understand that that's different for everyone. Every single person in the team has a different motivation. Some people want to rise. Some people want to stay where they are. Some people are motivated because they love the work that they do and they feel passionate about it. Some people are motivated because the paycheck that they get feeds their families. And you have to hear that, you have to know that, because you can't solve people's problems. You can't get them to do what you need them to do unless you know why they do what they do. And you also have to be adaptive. Leadership has to be adaptive. You can't say, this is the model I'm going to apply today. When I was the director of consular training, my colleagues in the leadership and management school, because we actually have a separate school for leadership and management, would teach model after model after model, and the students would get so fed up, they're like, I can't, because people that work at the State Department are overachievers. They're all straight A students or, wannabes, and in my case, a wannabe, and they approached training by wanting to learn it and get an A at it. We don't give grades, but that's the concept, right? They want to excel. And so they'd say, why do you teach us all these different models? Why can't you just teach us one model that we can learn and know and memorize and be done? And my colleagues would say, because that's not the point. The point is we're filling your toolbox. We're giving you all the different models so you can choose the one that works for you. For me, leaders are also decisive and they're accountable. The buck stops with me. I do not believe in hanging people out to dry. I do believe in holding them accountable for their judgment, for their decisions, for their obligations, and for their responsibilities. But the bottom line is, if my team fails, it is my failure. If my team succeeds, it is everyone's success. And it is really, really important to me that my other leaders in the building understand that as well. And I hold them accountable, at least I try to. You can ask my staff later if I actually achieve it. But I try to hold them accountable for their leadership as well, for their decisiveness, for their willingness to make the tough calls, to have the hard conversations. Honesty. Honesty is a really big piece of good leadership to me. I've learned this along the way from a lot of really great bosses, and this actually also goes to the question of work-life balance, which for me is really tied to leadership, although it's in a lot of ways it's a separate conversation, and we could have days of talking about that. But you have to be honest with people about your limitations, about your capabilities, about your shortcomings, about their performance, about what your expectations are and when they're not being met. Kim Scott is an author who wrote a book called Radical Candor. I don't necessarily, much like all the other leadership books I've read, and we'll talk about reading leadership books later, but I don't necessarily go with everything that she says in the book, but I love this idea that leaders have to be bluntly honest with people. And they have to expect their people to be bluntly honest with them. That is not a comfortable space to sit in. It's not a comfortable space to sit in as a leader, and it is not a particularly comfortable space to sit in as a follower. But the benefit that you derive from that level of honesty, that candor, that exchange that says, this is the thing that isn't necessarily working, or this is the idea that I don't think we can carry out, or boss, you're completely crazy, let's try something different, said with love, is really, really important. Consideration as well. You have to be considerate of your staff. And that doesn't just mean, saying good morning. Although culturally, actually, this is a very interesting sidebar, but in Germany, the leaders who succeed in that post, in my post in Frankfurt, the leaders who succeeded had one very specific trait in common. And that was that they sought out every member on their immediate staff every morning to say good morning. Because culturally, in Germany, if you do not greet someone in the morning, you are telling them that you do not value them. And the officers, the American officers, because we Americans, we like to go in, we like to get it done, we like to get our day started, coffee, email, no human contact. The officers who followed that model failed as leaders. Their staff, they could overcome it, right? They could win the trust and the confidence of their staff, but truly their staff was always kind of like, but he never says good morning. She never stops by to say hi on her way into the office. That was important there. And so I think for me, it's a really good example of consideration. You need to know what people have going on in their lives. You need to know what's important to them, and you need to give them the space. And that ties into work-life balance as well, but it doesn't have to. It can also just tie into general personality, knowing what matters to people and being considerate of that. And then humility, which we talked about. Humility for me is critically important for leaders. Leadership at its core really has to do with motivation. It has to do with getting people to do what you want or need them to do. So here's my question for all of you. What motivates you? What motivates you or your teams? Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's different.
Yeah. Anyone else? What motivates you?
I think in my field, what motivates me is it's making a better and safer community.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my motivation. It's because the community at the end, that's where my kids go out and play. That's where my family is at. So having a safer, healthier community, that's my motivation.
Yep. All right, come on. At least two other people. I'm proving a point here. Who else? Achievement. I like that. Anyone else? Inspiring others. Great. Do you notice what nobody said? Money. Nobody said money. There's a guy, his name is Daniel Pink. He wrote a book called Drive. There's a video that I decided not to play because it's 10 minutes long, but you can all look it up on YouTube later, in which he describes what motivates people. And it's not money. He describes a study that was done where they gave people completely routine tasks, where they literally had to do the same thing every single second. And in that scenario, money as a result of production was a motivator for people. But when you added any element of having to think for yourself, Pink said it fell apart. Money no longer became the motivation, and in fact, he points out in the video that the more money they gave people, the lower the motivation went. People's productivity actually dropped. He goes on, though, to describe that there are three things that actually motivate people, and they go to what all of you mentioned, if you think about it for a second. They are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. People are motivated by the ability to set their own course, to choose their own path, to do things the way that they believe they can and should do them. They're motivated by achievement. They're motivated by mastering something, by becoming good at it. And then they're motivated by purpose. And that to me, those three things, that understanding of the basic motivation of people, and this is people everywhere in every kind of industry, and in government, in private sector, in their volunteer work, in their community work, it's all there. And to me, a good leader is someone who actually understands that, and who then works to articulate the vision to help people find that purpose, to give people the space to grow, to be autonomous, to make their own choices, to make their own decisions, to succeed and fail in a safe space. And then also to achieve mastery, whether that's supporting training, whether that's giving people new opportunities, but giving them that ability to actually achieve a level of success, a level of mastery. That's essential to good leadership. Leadership is not management. And that, I think, is a really important takeaway for me. Both management and leadership, strong management and strong leadership, are essential to organizational success. You can't have one and not the other and still expect the organization to succeed. But leadership is about people, and management is about resources. And it's as simple as that. When you sit down and you plan your budget and you figure out how you're going to spend your money, that's management. When you sit down and you talk about what you're trying to achieve and how your people are going to get there, that's leadership. Colin Powell is quoted as saying, leadership is all about people. It's not about organizations. It's not about plans. It's not about strategies. It's about people, motivating people to get the job done, and leadership has to be people-centered. So that's something that is a big takeaway for me. But more importantly, leadership is also something you have to talk about. You can model expectations, but you want people to both do as you do and do as you say. Because if you don't talk about it, they can't define it. They have sort of an idea of, oh, this person's great to work for, or, oh, I really want to follow that person's vision, but they can't necessarily tell you why. And so it's really important to both do and say what matters to you. And here I do want to talk a little bit about two things specifically, two sort of good examples of that. One is work-life balance, and the other is making tough decisions. My very first tour in the Foreign Service, I had a boss who really believed in work-life balance. And I love her as a model because she didn't have kids. She didn't have a spouse at home. She had dogs. She had dogs that she loved. They were great dogs. And every single afternoon at 5:30, we were in Poland, she would put on her hat and her big giant coat and her scarf. And as she's doing this, she's walking through the office. And she's saying, "What are you doing here?" And you had to tell her. "What are you doing here?" And you tell her. And she'd either say, "Okay, if you need the time," or she'd say, "That can wait until tomorrow. Go home." And she would leave. She never pressured you to leave. If you had work you needed to get done, you got it done. So she respected your choice, but she created an understanding that 5:30 came, her dogs had to be walked. And she was gonna leave and she was gonna go walk them. Now, did she do a fair amount of second shifting? Absolutely. Does everybody know what second shifting is? Second shifting is when you go home to do whatever it is you have to do, and then in my case, when the kids are in bed, you get back on the computer and you work your second shift. Look, it's a reality. It's a reality at some point in almost everybody's life, right? And she did some of that, but she kept it sort of on the QT. We didn't always know when she was second shifting. She didn't do it all the time, but more importantly, she modeled that leaving at 5:30, that making something important. And because I was young and I was single and it was my first real job, it was also really important to me that she modeled that it didn't have to be going home to kids, because I didn't have kids, but I had spouses who did. I had colleagues who did. And for me, I always wanted to put my colleagues who had kids' needs first, because I love kids and I know how important it is to have your parents be present. And so I would always say, no, it's fine, I'll do this. You go home. And in doing what she did, she modeled that everybody needs work-life balance, not just the people who have spouses and kids or who have no spouses and kids. So, we all need it, even the people who don't have dogs. And that's something that's really important to me as well. My staff will tell you, they see me work late, but they also see me leave at 4 so that I can come get my girls. Because my girls love it when I pick them up at school because Daddy does it almost every day. Now, does that mean that sometimes I then end up logging in and doing some work after they're in bed? Absolutely. But I have found the balance that works for me, and what I want my team to see from me as a leader is that I expect them to find the balance that works for them too. That also goes to making tough decisions, and not always saying yes. Good leaders make tough decisions and they don't always say yes. We set vision, we also set priorities, and we model those priorities, and it goes to accountability as well. How am I doing on time? Okay, however long it takes. My team is going, cut it short. Cesar's going, however long you want. All right, I'm getting there. It's also really important to empower rising leaders, because what you don't want to have is you don't want to have a cult of personality. I have worked for leaders who were incredibly inspiring individuals, and when they left, the teams that they led fractured. Because they were the glue that held us all together. I worked for a wonderful leader who followed one of those cult of personality style leaders, and people would say, oh, well, she's not as present, she's not as out there, and people don't know her as well, she's not always in front. And I had the opportunity to talk to her about it, and she said, I don't want to be, because I don't want people loyalty to be to me, I want it to be to the mission. That's critically important in the Foreign Service. We transfer everyone to 3 years. And our teams stay behind, and they need to be able to keep the mission going forward, because our work is a work of decades, not of hours. And so that's really critical. But it also means that you have to empower new leaders. You have to give people their trust. You have to give them safe spaces to make mistakes. And you have to recognize their potential, and sometimes you have to push. And you also need to recognize that their leadership style may not be your leadership style. There are two sort of narratives in there. One is when I was the director of Consular Training Division at the Foreign Service Institute. So that's the division that trains all the vice consuls on how to adjudicate visa applications, among other things. That's really important work. Those guys are making national security decisions in about 3 minutes, about 150 times a day. And so you got to get it right. You got to get the training right. And my team came to me and they said, "Hey, boss, we want to completely restructure our training program." And I said, "Oh, okay. That's terrifying," in my head. Because if they got it wrong, if they broke the system, it was going to have pretty major implications for my career, their career, and pretty much everyone that works in the Foreign Service. But they needed to do it because we needed to modernize, we needed to update, and they wanted to take the whole entire program apart and then put it back together. And that would require taking us offline for 6 weeks, which meant we would also affect the staffing flows. But I worked with my leadership to give them a safe space to make mistakes, because to innovate, you have to be able to make mistakes. And so I got them the top cover. I gave them the room to take this thing completely apart and try to put it back together and to conduct experiments, and to listen to feedback and to tweak and to adjust. And it was absolutely terrifying. But boy, are those some amazing leaders that came out of that experience. They succeeded, as a note. They did really, really well. Won some training awards, which I'm really proud of them for. But they succeeded because they had the room to experiment and to innovate. And it's really important to empower new leaders to understand that that's part of leadership, that making those hard decisions is a key element of growth and of innovation. And then in terms of recognizing potential and pushing, I just want to say that I think almost every woman in the world, and probably 50% of the men that I know, have had my moments of imposter syndrome, where I think that people are having more confidence in me and my abilities than I have in myself. And I was blessed with bosses who would push really hard, would take off the training wheels, roll back the safety net, and push me off that cliff. And we as leaders are obligated to do that. We have to see the potential in our people when they don't see it in themselves. And sometimes we just have to give them that push. We also need to cultivate courageous followers, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that because I think we've already talked a lot about accountability and decision making, and we just need to empower our people to do that as well. If you're interested in the idea of courageous followership, there's a book by a guy named Ira Chaliff called Courageous Followership. It's a really interesting discussion of how followers can influence their leaders and how leaders need their followers. And the only other thing I sort of want to leave you with is leadership as a process. One of the consular leadership tenets and one of the Department of State leadership tenets is that we learn constantly. I said I would talk about leadership books. Look, I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old and a full-time job. I don't spend a lot of time reading leadership books. My mom used to like to send them to me. And I'd thank her, and then they'd sit on the shelf and gather dust. But you do have to participate in conversations about leadership. Read articles, think about a concept in leadership that you want to get smarter on and Google it, and you'll find 15 different articles from really credible sources about, that idea. Read blogs, read articles, talk to your friends, talk to the people that you know are good leaders, do leadership interviews. You don't have to be part of a program to ask senior leaders for an opportunity to talk to them about their leadership. You'll find that people like me like to talk about this stuff. If a 4-star general will take his time to talk to me about leadership, then pretty much anyone will take their time to talk to you, I'm sure, as well. People like to be asked. But nobody's model is going to be your model. Take what works for you and then jettison the rest. If something I said today resonated, great. If nothing I said today resonated, well, you're learning constantly. And that's fine too. It doesn't mean obsessive study, it means self-reflection. Every now and then, take the time to be in your head and think about leadership, but don't stay in your head. And then just ask for feedback and then take it. Feedback is hard, but it's so, so worth it. I'm going to stop there.
Okay. All right, so yes. Thank you so much, Ms. Flachsbart. So now we are open for Q&A. Any questions out there? I know you, yes, Regina. Do we have a microphone for them, Cesar? Yeah. Aquí está. Yes, so if you have your questions, there's going to be a microphone right here.
Working relationship that you've had, and how did you overcome that?
That's a good question. I had a boss that I could not read. He didn't talk a lot. He was an incredibly great mind. But he did not live in the world of emotion. And in case you haven't already gathered, I kind of live in that world. And because I am so generally good at reading people, the fact that I couldn't read him killed me. And I thought he hated me. And more importantly to me, I thought he thought I was incompetent. And then he wrote my first evaluation. And it was incredible. He had made observations about me and my ability that I never had made about myself. And it was because he was so analytical. And he's frighteningly intelligent. And he had taken that sort of analytic lens and he had applied it to my work and my contribution to my team. And it was like, oh, he noticed. But it was, it was like a turning point in our relationship, because then I was like, okay, well, I'm not doing everything completely wrong, right? So I can actually work with this. And I got to know sort of his lens a little bit better. And it ultimately made me a better follower for him. But it also made me a better boss. Because it helped me to understand how to work with those people who don't live comfortably in that emotional world like I do. So. Okay, another question, ladies? Maria? I know you're full of questions. Sure.
I guess for me, what advice would you give someone who's constantly fearful of failure, but also of success?
Know that you're not alone. I mean, I think that's the first one, right? Yeah, fear of success is a big one. I think everybody struggles a little bit with fear of failure, right? Nobody wants to disappoint. At least I don't want to disappoint other people. I have this whole list of people I don't want to disappoint, right? And I'm on that list somewhere, but there's a lot of other people on the list too. Find someone who believes in you and who will call you out when you're undermining yourself. Because I think that fear is such a demotivator. It can really eat away at us, and so we can build these stories in our head where we're telling ourselves that we're not able to achieve something because we're afraid of what will happen if we do or if we don't, right? And so I find that in those instances, having a mentor, having a friend, having a colleague, having a coach, whatever relationship works for you, that will actually call you out on it, and that will say, is that you talking or is that your fear talking, is really, really essential. And I think also, seek people out who will take away your safety net, and who will push you off that cliff, because sometimes it does take somebody else doing it. But it's so cheeseball, but believe in yourself, and remember that everybody out there doubts themselves. Literally everybody out there doubts themselves. I still have days when I doubt myself. It happens. Everybody does it. But recognize it and then put it aside. And fearing failure is a totally natural human activity. Fearing success is, I think, I may be wrong, and there have probably been studies, but I think is really unique to women. Which doesn't mean that men don't also fear success. I think there are certainly men who do. I know some of them. But I think we do it to ourselves more. But just remember that your success, regardless of how small it may seem to you, will inspire someone else. And that's what we all need, is we need somebody else standing in front of us. We need an example to strive for.
Exactly. Like you are doing for us right now. Otra pregunta? Questions, ladies?
Ask me in a decade. So I built my career first, and I had my babies afterwards. I had to wait for the right guy to walk into my life too, right? So this actually, the move to Nuevo Laredo was the first move with kids. And I will say that the thing that I learned in that more than anything else was that my girls are way more resilient than I gave them credit for. Way more. I was expecting, this really excruciating transition and tons of drama, and Lord knows we got the drama. They're 3 and 5, but they are so adaptive, and so strong. They're strong. I think also we have an obligation. I always said that when I joined the Foreign Service, I made the choice for myself. My husband decided to marry me, and he knew that I came with the Foreign Service. But when you choose to have children in the Foreign Service, you have to decide that they get a voice. And if it doesn't work for them, that at some point you probably have to walk away. Now, I'm very lucky because right now it seems to be working great for my kids. Now, let me tell you, trying to find a country that has a job that I'm really interested in, that I'm qualified for, that I can actually get, where my teleworking spouse can go and the schools are, at least decent enough that my kids will get a tolerable education, is something. It's definitely something. But yeah, I think we do a lot of talking. We don't keep secrets from our kids. We talk about this life, and we talk about the challenges. And I tell them, my daughter was really homesick one day, and she said, "Mommy, I really miss our house in Virginia." And I said, "You know what, baby, I do too. I do too." And that to me is so important to their emotional health, is that they see that this isn't just all fun and games, and mommy and daddy just love packing all of our entire life into boxes every 2 years and moving to somewhere new. I do love it. I absolutely love it. But it's hard. And so we don't try to hide that from them, because I think where people fall apart is where they try to shelter their kids too much from their realities, and then they're teaching them that it's not okay to have feelings about it. And for me, it's really important that my girls understand that they can feel about it. But for now, we're doing okay. But all of my foreign service friends who have older kids, teenagers especially, tell me that I'm in the easy part. So.
All right. We have time for 2 more questions. ¿Más preguntas? So, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I just need to repeat it for our video.
So my question was, she mentioned knowing our shortcomings and our limitations. So my question is, how do we go about articulating that to our followers without losing our credibility as a leader?
Okay, so how to go about articulating the passion?
How do you go about being transparent with your team about your shortcomings? Okay. It's scary the first time you do it. Look, I don't sit there with a list and say, these are the 15 things that you will come to find will drive you completely crazy about me as a boss. Although maybe that would actually circumvent some of the challenges. But I think people are so positively responsive to candor. And sometimes I think in that process you realize that because as a leader you're often in the position of pointing out to other people what they are not succeeding at, they really appreciate knowing that you're human. I really, this is a really simple example, but if it's not on my calendar, it doesn't exist, right? It just doesn't. And so, that's something that my team needed to know immediately. They had to know that, because otherwise we weren't going to succeed. Other shortcomings, I think it depends a little bit on the context and the conversation. People can benefit from your experience if you share a challenge in common, right? And so whether that's talking about fear, or whether that's talking about, imposter syndrome or struggling with work-life balance or any of those things, I find as a human being, for me, that it is way more inspiring to work for someone who's a human who happens to also be an incredible leader than it is to work for somebody who's an incredible leader because they're a leadership robot who has no failings. So, courage. Radical candor.
Okay, I have one last question here. So we are mostly women in here, and most of us are working women, but we're also moms, and sorry about that. But we're also working moms or single moms. So we have that struggle versus family versus career. Do you have any advice or strategies of how to go about those 2 paths?
Ask for help. We're not superhuman. I have the most incredible spouse in the entire world, who also works full-time, by the way. And it took us a while as new parents in Washington to figure out that we really needed to ask for help. And we needed to be able to admit when we were not handling it all perfectly ourselves. Surround yourself with the people that you need. Finding a great babysitter, man, that's a life changer for us because we don't have our family here. I can't fall back on grandma or grandpa, I wish I could, but they're not here. So surrounding yourself with the people you need. I think taking the help you get, that's a hard one. That was a really hard one for me. I'm a little bit control oriented. And when my wonderful, patient mother-in-law folded the laundry the wrong way. And my husband came downstairs at midnight to find me refolding the entire basket of baby clothes. He sat next to me on the couch and he said, you know, honey, some people don't even fold the baby clothes. So I think accepting the help that you're given as well. But yeah, ask for help.
Yes, thank you so much. Now, ladies, that's going to conclude our presentation. I want to honor everybody's time and their lunch break. But please stay around. There are some hors d'oeuvres over there. Please stay around and still talk or have questions for Ms. Flachsbart. And welcome. And I hope we get to see you guys again next month for our continuation of our leadership skills empowerment.